Lightning was startled, and she decided to fly back first to consult with Maisie. After briefly explaining the situation, Maisie suggested that they could extinguish the torches and sneak in, so the demons wouldn't be able to see them. Maisie could transform into an owl, allowing them to have night vision. Lightning felt useless, having run away at the first sign of fear. Maisie rubbed against Lightning's face, comforting her, suggesting no one could continue to shout for months under a demon's siege. Plus, as an adventurer, shouldn't Lightning be interested in these peculiar adventures? After hesitating for a moment, Lightning decided to follow Maisie's advice. Lightning wanted to overcome her fear, but why was Maisie so interested in exploring the ruins? She asked Maisie, "Is it because of the rewards of a basket full of eggs?" The owl blinked its round eyes and turned its head away. The atmosphere relaxed considerably, and Lightning gradually calmed down. Once again standing at the entrance of the ruins, Lightning took a deep breath, tightly grasping her revolver, and cautiously walked into the profound darkness. Lightning slowed her pace, carefully testing the edge of the stairs, then cautiously made her way down. After a turn, she suddenly saw a magic stone on the wall brightening the room. She carefully walked to the junction of the staircase where she saw water dripping down. At this point, the cries for help became clearer, as if they were ringing in her ears. In the center of the room was a stone platform with several figures standing on it. From their appearance and robust bodies, they were undoubtedly demons. In the middle of the high platform encircled by demons, stood a massive ice cube, within which was a woman dressed in a magnificent robe. Lightning felt somewhat scared seeing the demons, but Maisie said those demons should already be dead. Before she could finish speaking, Maisie had already flew towards the cube, heading towards the high platform. This startled Lightning so much that she froze on the spot, forgetting to reach out to hold Maisie back. By the time she reacted, Maisie had already pounced on a demon. The demon that was pecked a few times by the owl collapsed with a bang and immediately turned into a pile of ash. Lightning closely observed these stone-like creatures, their bodies covered with tiny cracks. Maisie flew to the top of the ice cube and pecked fiercely. This time it didn't shatter, but instead emitted a crisp knocking sound, indicating its extreme hardness. Lightning placed her hand on the cube, a cold chill seeping through her skin. The woman inside the cube seemed so lifelike, with her long blue hair. Not far from her was a red magic stone, repeatedly echoing the plea, "Save me," over and over again. Lightning and Maisie quickly flew to the outskirts of the town to report the situation to Roland. After listening to Lightning's description, Roland couldn't help but gasp in surprise. He looked at Lightning and thought to himself, Lightning was too audacious, daring to investigate the ancient ruins known to be inhabited by demons, with only a pigeon on her side. What was even more frightening was that there was a witch sealed in the ruins. Lightning also brought back the magic stone. As they opened the box, an anxious female voice suddenly appeared in everyone's ears. The sound was sometimes near, sometimes far, and was quite unnerving. Nightingale revealed herself, detecting magic within the stone. Roland thought for a moment, knew this appears to be a magical recording device that can continuously emit sound. Roland patted Lightning on the head, gently advising her, "Don't do this again, especially venturing into dangerous places without permission." He then looked at Nightingale, telling her to gather all members of the Witches' Union and axe to the office. The plan to search the ruins might need to be expedited. Once everyone had arrived, Roland narrated from beginning to end of the discoveries Lightning had made. Anna understood Roland's implications, the witch might still be alive, and through her, they could learn about events from over 400 years ago. Scroll, however, mentioned that the witch might not belong to that era. Leaf stated that the witch might not necessarily be on their side, a statement that made Roland ponder. Indeed, they both had valid points. If the ruins were left behind by the church, the witch sealed inside might well be on the side with the church. Lightning mentioned the witch's extravagant clothing, Roland suggesting she might be a high-ranking individual. If the woman harbored any bad intentions, there was no guarantee that her abilities would not pose a threat to the Witch Union. Lily suddenly spoke up, surprised that everyone was considering whether the witch was on their side. Rem tried to stop her, but Lily did not cease and questioned how someone from 400 years ago could still be alive. Lightning argued that the woman was completely different from the lifeless demons. Her skin was smooth, and her lips full of color. Maisie kept nodding in agreement. Wendy stepped in to interrupt their argument, saying that regardless of whether the witch was dead or alive, they had to give it a try. Wendy suggested that if she turned out to be a church witch, all they needed to do was attach the god's stone of punishment before she woke up. Moreover, they had Nightingale and Anna. Most importantly, this witch might have information about the calamity 400 years ago. Roland agreed with Wendy. Intelligence about the demons was crucial to Border Town. He had to take the initiative in the future confrontations. Roland looked towards Axe, asking about the status of the First Army. Axe saluted and stated they could only mobilize a maximum of 50 men. The other squads were already recruiting refugees from various places, and they needed to leave forces behind to prevent Timothy from launching a large-scale attack on the Western Territory. Roland nodded in acknowledgement and began to strategize. Suddenly, Rem looked out and gasped. Everyone followed her gaze out the window and was taken aback. Unbelievably, Roland looked outside of the window and saw that the gloomy sky was unexpectedly filled with snow. It was snowing, which was unusual. To his knowledge, the Western Territory only experienced snowfall once during winter, and it wasn't even winter yet. Outside the city walls, demonic beasts were slowly advancing towards the city wall. Roland turned towards Axe, inquiring if there was ever snowfall during the last month of fall. Axe turned into a serious expression, stating that he hadn't experienced such an event in his 8 years in the town. Opening the window, Roland pondered. The heavy snowfall implied the coming of the month of demons, and during this time, the entire Western Territory would face the threat of demonic beasts. Deploying the First Army was out of the question. Even transporting the witches by hot air balloon had become dangerous. He had no choice but to suspend the rescue plan, waiting until the sky clears up. On Slumbering Isle in the fjords, Thunder was drinking hot, steaming fish soup. He was eager to start his next adventure. The sights he'd seen on his last expedition had left him stunned. He was very curious about what exactly was on that piece of land. Tilly smiled and mentioned that she planned to personally go to Border Town, also intending to experience the month of demons in the western region, and she invited Thunder to join her. Thunder was silent for a moment, but ultimately refused. He explained that her daughter is having a good time there. After all, anything could happen on an adventure, and he had lost her mother already. He didn't want to lose her as well. Tilly understood what he meant, and she handed him a piece of paper, beginning to talk about business. Although Thunder had helped them a lot, the price for hiring witches had to be according to the rates on the paper. Thunder finished the fish soup in one gulp and laughed out loud. He chose 3 witches and generously offered 4,800 gold. After he left, Ashes hesitated, voicing her concern that although this could bring a substantial amount of wealth to Slumbering Isle, the risk of the abilities of the witches could also be exposed in the process. She was afraid that this information could reach the church. Slumbering Spell is a brand new guild formed by Tilly. Here, explorers from the Fjord Islands can hire witches with suitable abilities to assist them in their adventures or to provide various services like building houses, manufacturing, and repairing items. Making money isn't Tilly's main concern. Instead, she hopes to use the guild to introduce more people to Slumbering Isle and establish relations with them. Thunder once said, "Fear comes from the unknown," so she hopes to start in the fjords, making people accept witches, and understand that witches are not different from them, and are certainly not emissaries of demons. As their conversation went on, they shifted the topic to discuss that Maisie had not yet returned to Slumbering Isle, and they were worried about what might have happened. Ashes mentioned that the living conditions in Border Town were good, and she was worried that the witches might not want to come back. Tilly suddenly suggested, "In that case, let's go there." Ashes was stunned for a moment before she could respond. Tilly laughed, stating that they had promised to help Roland fight against the demonic beasts and bring back the other witches on the way. They needed to start selecting the witches to go to Border Town in the morning. Most importantly, she wanted to see what her annoying brother had turned into. Meanwhile, Roland climbed onto the city wall where soldiers equipped with revolving rifles each watched over their posts. The new city wall was much taller than the previous stone wall, preventing demonic beasts from leaping over. As Roland made his way along the wall, the soldiers straightened their backs and saluted him. Their high spirits already marked a stark contrast to the original state of the militia just a year ago. Just then, the sound of a fierce argument came from behind. Roland looked toward the noise source and saw a group of people arguing loudly in the middle of the residential area. One of them, dressed in a black and white uniform, appeared to be a municipal official. Carter charged directly into the crowd, subduing the instigators of the fight. The prince's personal guards ordered everyone to stop, and the situation was quickly brought under control. Seeing Roland, the man who had been beaten fell to his knees. Roland turned to the official, whose face had been bruised, and asked him what had happened. The official claimed that the refugees had initiated the fight. He had been distributing food when he was suddenly attacked by the damn Mad Dog refugee. The man restrained by Carter immediately shouted in defense that the official was lying. He claimed that these people had colluded with serfs to extort them, charging money for each serving of food. When Roland had taken them in, he clearly stated that the food was to be distributed for free. Roland was slightly taken aback. The Eastern region refugees had been thoroughly vetted by the city hall, and all craftsmen, literate individuals, or those with special skills had been moved into the inner ring of the town. In theory, those remaining were ordinary civilians. However, the tone and vocabulary of the man didn't match those of a commoner. On the contrary, the city hall member, who was full of derogatory words such as damn and mad dog and constant cussing, was extremely disappointing. Roland knew most likely this official was a knight from Duke Ryan, who later surrendered. Roland affirmed that he did say that housing and food would be provided for free before they officially joined Border Town, and this promise still stood. He reiterated this in front of all the refugees. Upon hearing this, the refugees loudly praised Roland's kindness and shouted, "Long live the prince!" But, as a brawl had occurred, Roland ordered the personal guards to bring all the people involved to the castle. He wanted to personally adjudicate this incident. The official's face suddenly turned pale. Roland then looked at him, asking about the charged porridge and what was really going on. Back in the castle hall, Roland took his seat at the head and looked down at the two men. After everyone had a chance to tell their side of the story, he finally knew what had happened. The official, a man named Koya, resented being stripped of his knighthood and was annoyed by the tedious paperwork of the city hall. His frustration had vented towards the refugees. He took the opportunity of distributing porridge to deliberately charge the refugees and stir up trouble between the two groups. In fact, Koya had been charging for porridge for several days already. Because of his conspicuous city hall uniform, most refugees stayed silent out of fear of reprisal from an official, which only emboldened him. It wasn't until today that someone stood up to protest. Upon understanding the situation, Roland let out a sigh. He hadn't expected corruption and stagnation to have started this early. Roland called Barav to his side and asked in a low voice how such a situation would typically be handled by a lord. Barav responded that if the offender was a noble, he could escape any punishment by handing over a few gold royals. The crime of a commoner attacking a noble could range from amputation to flogging. However, Koya was no longer a noble. Roland pondered for a moment and decided to follow the rules of Greycastle. He stood up and swept his gaze over the entire hall to deliver his judgment. Koya, for neglect of duty and extortion of refugees, was stripped of all his duties in the city hall from this day forth, sentenced to 10 years of labor in the mines, and fined 3 times the amount of his extortionate income. As for Wade, who initiating an attack on a city hall official, was sentenced to 10 strokes of the whip. He reiterated that the distribution of porridge would continue to be free, and all extorted money would be returned. Roland sat in his chair, the incident making him realize that as the number of citizens continued to increase and the authority of the city hall rapidly expanded, it might be time to address the issue of internal regulation. Many modern institutions were not applicable to this era. Legal interpretation and judicial powers were something he needed to keep in his own hands. He needed a simple system that could supervise the organization without requiring too many people. Nightingale appeared, and Roland clasped her hand on his shoulder. He said he wanted to establish a new department to oversee the city hall and arrest any individuals or groups that could potentially threaten the stability of the western region. This department would be responsible only to him. Roland tentatively named it the Western Territory Security, and he wanted Nightingale to be the chief. Nightingale had the ability to distinguish between truth and lies. Roland said that if Nightingale was willing, he could provide her with a special afternoon tea with ice cream in winter. Nightingale gently pinched his hand and said that she would agree to anything Roland said and anything Roland wanted to do.
Yeah, boy.
Such a system would be in line with the checks and balances of power that are common in many modern political systems, while also addressing the specific needs and constraints of Roland's situation. This kind of internal department could help prevent corruption, and could also play a role in maintaining social stability and justice. Wade staggered back to his residence, and the old man immediately greeted him. Seeing the wounds on Wade's back, the old man urgently asked him to lie down. The old man originally wanted to sprinkle ash on the wound, but Wade quickly stopped him, saying that the knight had said that it was fine to leave it open like this, and it would heal in 2 or 3 days. The old man shook his head and said that Wade would have a high fever tonight if left untreated. Wade said his wound wasn't very painful, but rather felt cool and itchy. He knew this was a sign of healing. After the whipping, his back was doused with a bucket of water. The knight told him that this water could eliminate all disease-causing microbes. The old man had never heard of these words. Wade said it must be related to the witches. The old man lowered his head, and after a long time, he said in a deep voice that Wade shouldn't have stood up for him. Wade said that if they continued to tolerate it, they would be treated even worse. He feared that the two of them wouldn't last until the end of winter. Moreover, he purposely chose that time to fight Koya. Wade knew that Prince Roland would appear on the city wall at that time every day. He believed that the prince hated those who tarnished his reputation. He had also found out before that the prince was very kind and wise. Thus he took the bet, and he was correct. The old man was somewhat sad. He knew that Wade could have lived a decent life in Border Town, but he chose to stay here for him. Wade smiled and said that it was the old man who saved him back when he almost died. He patted the old man's shoulder and said everything would get better. On the sea, the weather was getting colder. Captain Jack and the witches were sitting together, sipping fish soup to keep warm. The blonde woman named Andrea praised the taste of the fish soup, but Ashes couldn't stand the fishy smell of the sea fish. Andrea sarcastically said that Ash's taste had been spoiled by the cooking methods of Border Town, and her courage was dwindling. Ashes glared at her, and Andrea laughed and said, "If Ash can't stand the smell of fish, how can everyone expect Ash to stand up when Lady Tilly needs her?" Ashes understood that Andrea was deliberately picking a fight. Ashes disdainfully said that Andrea's arrows could not compare to the weapons of Border Town, and once she tasted Prince Roland's delicacies, she would know. The two were the top witches in Slumbering Isle in terms of combat power and often argued about who was the strongest. Though they often bickered, they would undoubtedly fight side by side without hesitation when danger arose. Suddenly, a sailor burst into the cabin, his face pale with fear, yelling that mutant sea ghosts had appeared. Everyone rushed out of the stern building to see more than a dozen fish-bodied, crab-legged creatures on the deck. They moved swiftly, their 6 legs moving like a giant cockroach. Andrea snapped her fingers, and a golden light emerged from between her fingers, morphing into the shape of a bull. She was ready to compete with Ashes to see who could kill more. Tilly infused magic into the flying magic stone and soared into the midair, overlooking the entire deck. These monsters were somewhat different from before. As soon as Ashes joined the battlefield, the situation quickly changed. Any demonic beasts daring to face the giant sword would be cut in half. Andrea was not to be outdone. Her magical longbow could shoot anything handy as an arrow, with both power and accuracy being astonishing. Seeing the demonic beasts being quickly killed, Tilly remained alert. She felt a huge monster under the ship, continuously hitting the bottom of the ship. Before she could finish her sentence, a shadow swept from under the ship, and the sailboat began to shake violently again. Tilly landed back on the deck and briefly explained the situation. They had to force it out of the sea. The monster came again. Savvy ran to position and jumped out of the ship's rope. Several circles of hemp rope were tied tightly around her waist. The other end of the rope was in Ash's hands, steadily controlling her descent. The shadow struck, and Savvy instantly opened the barrier. The monster hit the barrier head-on, its huge body suddenly stopped. Savvy let out a muffled hum. Ashes pulled hard with one hand and barely pulled Savvy onto the deck when a giant sea beast had already roared out of the water. In the blink of an eye, Andrea had flown above the monster's head. She summoned the magic ball, pulled the full string, and the arrow made purely of magic power emitted a piercing roar, like a thunderbolt, and penetrated the monster's body. Then there was a loud bang, and it exploded into pieces. Andrea fell into the sea with a plop. Suddenly she began to shout and yell, saying she couldn't swim. Ashes sighed helplessly, shook her head and then jumped into the sea, and saved her. Tilly finally breathed a sigh of relief. The threat of the sinking ship was lifted, and at least she didn't have to worry about swimming to Border Town. Suddenly, she felt a chill on the tip of her nose and looked up, only to freeze on the spot. Snowflakes were floating in the sky. Tilly understood that snow represented the beginning of the month of the demons. It was only autumn and it was already snowing, which meant that Border Town must have started being attacked by demonic beasts. A few days later, they arrived at the place where they had picked up the witches from slumbering all last time. Tilly was very interested in the hot air balloon. Before disembarking, she asked Captain Jack to wait here for a few days. Tilly began to ascend and then asked Savvy to summon an invisible barrier to let everyone slowly rise. Before long, they crossed over the mountaintop. Then, under Ash's guidance, it took them half a day to finally arrive at Border Town. The first thing that caught Tilly's eye was a uniquely shaped steel bridge. Ashes thought it was a waste of materials, as a pontoon bridge would solve the transportation issue. Andrea elegantly wagged her finger and said that it had its value. Once the town expanded, a pontoon bridge would obstruct river transportation. Tilly didn't care about their routine dispute but set her eyes on the other side of the river. After crossing the steel bridge, immediately two guards came over and asked what they were doing. One of the guards looked at them carefully and asked if they were witches. This question caught Tilly off guard. Although she already knew that the existence of witches was public in this town, when she personally heard an ordinary person ask this sentence in such a calm tone, it still stirred a wave in her heart. She nodded, and the guard smiled and asked them to wait there. Then he immediately ran towards Border Town. Just as Ashes was about to speak about Tilly's identity, she was interrupted by Tilly. Tilly was curious about how Roland would receive a witch from another city. Not long after, a tall blonde woman dressed in a white robe walked over. It was Nightingale, and Ashes greeted briefly, and Tilly could feel the sharp aura emanating from Nightingale. Without a doubt, this woman was a combat witch, and an incredibly powerful one. Nightingale looked at Ashes first and then swept her gaze over everyone. When her eyes landed on Tilly, she suddenly paused. The sharp feeling disappeared in an instant, replaced by warmth like water. She gently introduced herself first, recognizing Tilly as Roland's sister at first glance. Under Nightingale's guidance, they entered the castle. Sylvie was the first one to come over. She told them that the prince had already sent someone to notify the others. A voice that sounded familiar, yet strangely foreign, echoed from behind Sylvie. Tilly raised her head. A young man was smiling at her. His appearance had not changed much from her memories, but his smile and demeanor were completely different from before. "Welcome to Border Town, my dear sister," he said.